Far away in a quiet corner of the galaxy, there was a planet unlike any other. Its skies shimmered in shades of green and blue, and its forests glowed faintly under the light of twin suns. The surface of the planet was alive with movement, creatures that the mind of any visitor from another world could hardly imagine. Streams sparkled like liquid crystals, and mountains stretched so high that their peaks disappeared into the swirling clouds above. This was a peaceful world, full of intelligent life that had lived there for countless generations. The inhabitants, called the Zari, were tall and graceful, with skin that reflected the colors of their surroundings. They were clever, kind, and deeply connected to their planet. They had created amazing cities, not with steel and stone, but with living structures grown from the planet itself. Trees could bend and shape themselves into bridges. Plants could store energy for the city's needs. Every part of the planet seemed alive and part of one grand design. For centuries, the Zari had lived in harmony, exploring their world, studying the stars, and sending probes out to neighboring systems. They were curious and careful, always respectful of the delicate balance that sustained their life. But despite their intelligence, they were not immune to the dangers of the universe. In recent months, strange cosmic storms had begun to sweep across their region of space. At first, the storms seemed minor, flashes of energy in the skies, small disturbances that the Zari could repair quickly. But soon the storms grew stronger. Powerful currents of charged particles tore through their atmosphere. Their communication networks flickered and died. Machines failed in ways that were impossible to understand. For the first time, the Zari realized that their knowledge and technology might not be enough to save them. The storms were unlike anything they had encountered. No one knew why they were happening or where they had come from, but the effects were clear. The cities that once thrived in perfect harmony with the environment were now at risk. Vital systems for food, water, and energy were failing. Panic began to spread quietly among the Zari. They were a calm and patient people, but even the calmest could feel fear when the world around them began to crumble. As the situation worsened, the leaders of the Zari gathered in a council chamber that hovered above a forest glowing with bioluminescent light. The room was alive with whispers and soft glows as each member of the council considered the problem. They debated endlessly, examining every possibility, trying to find a solution. They tried repairing their systems, adapting to the storms and using stored energy reserves, but nothing seemed enough. The storms were relentless, and the planet was beginning to show the strain. The Zari realized that they might need help from outside their world. This was a frightening thought. Their species had always been self-reliant. They had explored their galaxy carefully, making contact with only a few nearby civilizations. And yet, now, they had no choice. They had to reach out beyond their own star system. They had to hope that someone, anyone, would answer their call. The Zari worked together to create a signal, unlike anything they had sent before. It was carefully designed to be understood by any intelligent life, no matter how different it might be from them. It carried the story of their planet, the danger they faced, and a plea for assistance. Every part of the message was precise. It explained the storms, the damage to their technology, and the urgent need for help. They hoped that another civilization, perhaps one stronger or more experienced in surviving harsh conditions, might hear it and respond. The signal was not sent lightly. Each Zari involved in the process felt a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that someone would come, fear that they might be alone. Once the message was ready, it was launched into the void, traveling through the darkness of space faster than any living thing could move. It passed stars, planets, and cosmic debris, racing into regions of space that no Zari had ever explored. For days, the Zari watched the skies, hoping for a response. They monitored every faint signal, every shift in the cosmic winds, searching for signs that another life form had received their call. The waiting was exhausting. Families huddled together in their homes, worried about what might come. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly, trying to repair what they could, but their efforts were only partially successful. The storm damage was too great for them to fix on their own. And yet, Despite the fear and uncertainty, a sense of determination grew among the Zari. They had always been a resilient people. They were intelligent, cooperative, and patient. They knew that survival required more than strength. It required hope and unity. The signal, sent with such care and intention, was now their lifeline. As the days passed, the storms continued, and the skies remained restless. The Zari began to speak quietly of what might come. They imagined different scenarios. Perhaps no one would respond at all, and they would have to find another way to survive. Or perhaps a friendly civilization would arrive, offering assistance and saving their world. The uncertainty was unbearable, but they could not abandon hope. And then, one evening, as the twin suns set and painted the skies with a mix of orange and violet, something unusual happened. A faint shimmer appeared at the edge of the planet's atmosphere, like a distant light flickering in the void. The Zari gathered, holding their breath, staring at the signal returning in ways they could not yet understand. They did not know what or who it was, but they knew that their call for help had been noticed. In that moment, fear and hope intertwined, creating a sense of anticipation that pulsed through every heart. The planet, once quiet and isolated, had reached out into the cosmos, and now something, or someone, was coming in response. No one could predict what the future held. The Zari had lived peacefully for countless generations, but now their lives were on the edge of change. They had sent a cry for help into the infinite universe, and it was answered. Who would come? What would arrive? And how would the encounter change their world forever? These questions hung in the air as the Zari watched the skies, waiting, hoping, and preparing for the unknown. In the midst of fear, the seeds of courage had been planted, and though they could not see it yet, this was only the beginning of a story that would test everything they knew about survival, trust, and the true strength of life itself. Days passed after the first strange shimmer appeared in the Zari skies. The alien population, once calm and composed, could hardly contain their excitement and fear. Every time the light flickered or shifted, hearts skipped and whispers filled the glowing cities. No one knew exactly what was coming, only that it was something from beyond their world, something that might change everything. The Zari watched with wide, hopeful eyes, standing at the edges of their forests or atop the living towers that stretched from their cities. Families held hands and scientists adjusted their instruments, trying to understand the signals that were returning. It was unlike any communication they had ever received before. The signals seemed alive, pulsating with a rhythm that suggested intelligence but also something completely alien, something they had no way of fully predicting. Then, one evening, the first ships appeared. They were massive and unlike anything the Zari had ever seen. The vessels moved with a quiet strength, gliding through the atmosphere as if they belonged there. Their surfaces were dark and rough, covered in layers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Zari's instruments could detect that the ships were powered by technology far beyond their own understanding. And yet, there was something about them that felt alive. The ships moved as though guided by instinct, not just mechanics, responding to the planet's magnetic fields and weather patterns. From a distance, the Zari could see the silhouettes of figures inside the ships. They were large and heavily built, moving with confidence and a natural ease that suggested a species perfectly adapted to harsh environments. The Zari had no name for them yet, no idea who they were, but a mixture of awe and fear filled the air. As the ships landed, the ground shook slightly, sending vibrations through the living cities. Trees swayed unnaturally, and streams rippled with energy. The Zari had expected visitors, but not in this form. They had hoped for peaceful helpers, perhaps similar in appearance or temperament to themselves. Instead, they faced beings entirely different, unfamiliar in every way. These were the Deathworlders, a species that had long been whispered about in distant corners of the galaxy. Stories had described them as survivors of worlds where life was brutal, where storms, predators, and famine were constant companions. The Zari had never encountered them directly, only heard tales of their fearlessness and adaptability. And now, those very beings were standing on their planet, moving through forests and across plains with careful observation. Every step the Deathworlders took seemed measured, as if they were reading the land itself, sensing its dangers and resources simultaneously. The Zari could hardly believe their eyes. At first, there was silence. Neither side moved toward the other, unsure of what to expect. The Zari remained in their cities, observing, whispering to each other in low tones. The Deathworlders explored with curiosity and purpose, examining the plants, the structures, and the streams. They touched the glowing trees, bending and testing their resilience. They crouched near the crystal streams, dipping their hands into the water with careful, almost respectful gestures. Though the Deathworlders appeared intimidating, their actions suggested intelligence and awareness rather than aggression. The Zari began to feel a strange sense of relief. Perhaps these beings had come to help. Perhaps they were not the threat they had feared. Still, caution remained. Every Zari understood that appearances could be deceiving, and the unknown often carried hidden dangers. Communication between the species was challenging. The Zari tried using their standard signals, sending pulses of light and vibrations to represent words and concepts. The Deathworlders did not respond immediately in ways the Zari could interpret, yet they seemed to understand gestures, following instructions and performing tasks that indicated comprehension. Slowly, small interactions began. A Zari engineer would show a Deathworlder how to repair a damaged energy conduit. The Deathworlder, in turn, would use strength and precision to complete the task quickly and efficiently. Watching these exchanges, the Zari felt a mixture of admiration and surprise. They realized that despite the Deathworlders' intimidating appearance, they were not careless or reckless. Every action had purpose. Every movement was calculated to maximize survival and efficiency. The Zari began to hope that these strangers could truly help save their planet. As the days continued, the Deathworlders proved their resilience. They navigated the remaining storms with ease, their bodies and technology unaffected by conditions that would cripple the Zari. Where the aliens struggled to repair failing systems, the Deathworlders adapted quickly, improvising solutions that the Zari had never considered. They moved like shadows across the planet, quietly stabilizing energy fields, repairing broken conduits, and reinforcing the fragile structures that had been damaged by the cosmic storms. The Zari observed everything carefully, learning from the newcomers. Their initial fear began to fade, replaced by curiosity and a growing respect. They realized that survival was not only about technology or intelligence, but also about courage, adaptability, and determination. The Deathworlders embodied all of these qualities in ways the Zari had never witnessed. Even as progress was made, uncertainty remained. The Zari did not fully understand the intentions of the Deathworlders. Were they truly allies? Or was there some hidden agenda? Could they be trusted completely, or would the planet pay a price for the help it received? These questions weighed heavily on the leaders and citizens alike. Yet, despite these doubts, the work continued. The two species slowly began to establish routines, learning to cooperate in ways neither could have imagined before. The Deathworlders taught the Zari new techniques for repairing and strengthening systems. The Zari shared knowledge about the planet's ecosystem, guiding the newcomers on how to avoid harming delicate life forms. In this exchange, a fragile trust began to form, based not on friendship but on shared necessity and respect. At night, when the twin suns set and the sky shimmered with the light of distant stars, the Zari would gather to watch the Deathworlders at work. The newcomers moved with confidence, their large forms silhouetted against glowing forests and sparkling rivers. Families whispered stories to each other, imagining what life must be like on the harsh worlds the Deathworlders had survived. Children, usually timid and shy, watched in awe as the strangers demonstrated strength and skill far beyond their own. The Zari began to feel that perhaps the arrival of these beings was not a disaster, but an opportunity. Their planet had been at the brink of despair, and now, in the midst of uncertainty and fear, hope had returned. The unknown had arrived, and with it, a chance to survive against the impossible. Even as the skies continued to flicker with remnants of the storms, the Zari began to imagine a future in which their world might thrive once more. They understood that much work remained, that the challenges were far from over. Yet with the Deathworlders by their side, the impossible suddenly seemed achievable. They were no longer alone. The universe had answered their cry for help in a form they could never have predicted. And as the twin suns disappeared below the horizon, painting the skies with shades of violet and orange, the Zari felt the first true sense of relief in many weeks. Their planet had been noticed, their call had been answered, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, they knew that together they could face whatever challenges the cosmos had in store. The days turned into weeks as the Zari and the Deathworlders continued their cautious cooperation. At first, every movement, every interaction was filled with hesitation. The Zari were intelligent and careful, always planning their actions and thinking several steps ahead. The Deathworlders, however, seemed to operate in a different rhythm. Their responses were fast, precise, and unhesitating. They moved through the damaged cities with the confidence of beings accustomed to extreme danger, assessing problems instantly and acting with skill that amazed the Zari. At first, the Zari were intimidated. The newcomers' size, strength, and seemingly unshakable calm made them appear almost invincible. But gradually the Zari began to see something else, something that was just as remarkable as their power. The Deathworlders were not careless or destructive. Every action had purpose, every gesture served a goal. They were not there to conquer or harm. They were there to solve problems, to help the planet survive, even if their methods were unusual. To the Zari, communication remained a challenge, but it slowly improved. The Zari developed new ways of sharing information, using light pulses, vibrations, and gestures that the Deathworlders could interpret. In return, the newcomers demonstrated their own methods of conveying meaning. Though it was far from perfect, it was enough for the two species to work together. They learned to coordinate on tasks that neither could accomplish alone. The Zari had knowledge of the planet's delicate ecosystems, understanding which areas could be repaired quickly without causing long-term damage. The Deathworlders brought experience in surviving and thriving in environments that would destroy lesser beings. When the two combined their skills, progress became noticeable. Broken energy conduits were restored, damaged habitats were stabilized, and the most critical systems of the cities began functioning again. The Zari watched in awe as the Deathworlders moved with deliberate efficiency, bending and lifting structures, repairing fragile networks, and even predicting failures before they occurred. It was as if they could see the weaknesses hidden within the planet itself. Despite the cooperation, tension remained. The Zari were intelligent but cautious, and they could not forget the unknown origin of these beings. Every day they asked themselves whether the Deathworlders could truly be trusted. Were these strangers genuinely here to help? Or were they using the planet's desperation for their own benefit? There were moments of doubt, small arguments among the Zari leaders, and secret discussions about whether they should continue relying on the newcomers. But each time, the results of collaboration became impossible to ignore. When the Deathworlders repaired a collapsed bridge or stabilized a failing power grid, the Zari realized that survival depended on these beings, no matter the fear or mistrust. Slowly, the Zari began to set aside their worries, focusing instead on the immediate work that would save their world. It was not friendship that drove this partnership, but necessity and mutual respect. Yet even in necessity, bonds began to form. Small moments of understanding, gestures of help, and silent acknowledgement of each other's abilities. The Zari also began to learn from the Deathworlders. Watching them navigate the harsh conditions left by the storms, the aliens noticed their unique ways of problem-solving. When a storm would suddenly shift, the Deathworlders would move quickly, adapting their methods to stabilize the environment. They used tools and techniques that were simple yet effective, combining intelligence with brute strength in ways the Zari had never considered. The Zari engineers took notes, experimenting with the methods themselves. Slowly, they began to adopt some of the newcomers' strategies, learning to combine their own precision and care with the Deathworlders' speed and resilience. This learning process was exciting but also humbling. The Zari had always prided themselves on their intelligence, their ability to plan and predict outcomes. Yet here were beings who could adapt instantly, thriving in situations where the Zari could only hesitate and calculate. Respect grew quietly, even if the two species still remained wary of each other. Life in the cities began to adjust to the new reality. The Zari population could now move through damaged areas with confidence, following paths stabilized by the Deathworlders. Streams and energy conduits that had threatened collapse were repaired, allowing homes and workplaces to function. Children who had once been frightened by the storms and the presence of strange visitors began to watch with fascination. They saw the Deathworlders as both fearsome and fascinating, giants capable of incredible feats, yet working to protect rather than destroy. Families whispered stories about what these beings must have endured on their own harsh worlds, imagining challenges that seemed impossible to survive. These stories spread quickly, and in the process a shared sense of wonder and hope began to emerge. The Zari felt that perhaps their planet's future was not as bleak as it had seemed. Small rituals and routines developed as the two species worked side by side. The Zari would prepare tools and supplies in specific ways, and the Deathworlders would respond with coordinated movements, repairing and reinforcing structures with speed and precision. Though words were limited, gestures became a language of cooperation. A simple hand signal could instruct an entire group of Deathworlders to move or adjust equipment, while a light pulse could communicate a warning of instability or danger. Over time, these small signs became a system of communication that both sides understood. There was still tension, still the constant need to remain cautious, but it was balanced by growing trust. The Zari began to realize that perhaps survival required more than careful planning and intelligence. It required courage, adaptability, and a willingness to accept help from unexpected sources. One evening, as the twin suns set and painted the skies with brilliant colors, a group of Zari gathered to observe the Deathworlders repairing a particularly fragile section of their energy grid. The newcomers moved with steady confidence, balancing on narrow walkways and handling delicate components as if they were extensions of their own bodies. The Zari watched silently, learning not only the technical methods, but also the attitude and mindset required to survive and solve problems under pressure. There was no fear in the Deathworlders' eyes, only focus and determination. The Zari realized that strength was not just in physical ability, but in resilience, patience, and the ability to remain calm under overwhelming pressure. By the end of this period, the Zari began to see the value of their collaboration in a new light. The planet, once on the brink of disaster, was beginning to stabilize. Systems that had been failing were now functional. Forests and rivers, threatened by the storms, were showing signs of recovery. And most importantly, the Zari had learned lessons that went beyond technology. They had discovered courage, adaptability, and the importance of working together, even with beings that were completely different from themselves. The Deathworlders, in their quiet, efficient way, had transformed not only the planet's systems, but also the mindset of its people. The aliens realized that survival depended not only on knowledge or planning, but on the ability to cooperate, to trust, and to act decisively when faced with the unknown. Though there was still uncertainty, and the future remained unpredictable, the Zari had hope. They had begun to see the Deathworlders not only as rescuers but as teachers in resilience and problem-solving. And in the quiet moments, when the cities glowed softly under the light of twin moons, the Zari reflected on how far they had come. From fear and desperation had grown respect and understanding. From isolation had emerged collaboration. And though the journey was far from over, the Zari now knew that together with the Deathworlders, they had a chance to face whatever challenges awaited their world. The cosmic storms grew stronger with each passing day. The winds howled across the forests and plains, shaking the living towers and bending even the strongest trees. Rivers that had once flowed steadily now surged unpredictably, carrying debris and damaging parts of the cities. The Zari, though resilient, began to feel the weight of the planet's fragile state. Panic rippled quietly through the population. Families stayed indoors, fearful of sudden lightning strikes and swirling winds. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly, but the storms moved faster than they could anticipate. The Zari began to wonder if even the Deathworlders, despite their incredible abilities, could withstand the worst of these natural disasters. The planet seemed determined to test their survival skills in ways no one could have predicted. Yet amidst the fear, the Deathworlders remained calm. Where the Zari panicked, they acted. They moved through the cities with precision, using their knowledge of harsh environments to predict the path of the storms and reinforce vulnerable structures. The aliens watched in awe as the newcomers climbed unstable towers, tied down, weakened bridges, and stabilized energy conduits that the winds threatened to destroy. Even when lightning struck dangerously close, the Deathworlders worked steadily, unaffected by conditions that would have immobilized the Zari. It became clear that their presence was not just helpful, it was crucial. The Zari could no longer survive alone. They had to work together with the Deathworlders if the planet had any hope of enduring the fury of the storms. Communication intensified. The Zari learned to send rapid light signals and pulses to indicate areas that were most at risk. The Deathworlders responded with gestures, swift movements, and coordinated actions that the Zari could follow and adapt to. Together, they established a system of teamwork that became increasingly effective. Entire sections of the cities, once threatened by destruction, were stabilized before the storms could reach them. Bridges that had been cracked were reinforced. Water channels that threatened flooding were redirected. And the energy systems, which powered the cities and forests alike, began to function almost normally despite the surrounding chaos. Each small victory inspired confidence, both in the Zari and in the Deathworlders, creating a sense of shared purpose that neither species had felt before. The Zari began to take note of the strategies the Deathworlders used. When a violent gust threatened a living tower, the newcomers would brace it with a combination of mechanical support and precise movement, allowing the structure to bend rather than break. They could predict when the rivers would overflow and position themselves to guide the water safely through channels without damaging the surrounding areas. The aliens marveled at this adaptability. They realized that survival in extreme conditions was not just about strength or intelligence, it was about observation, anticipation, and courage. Slowly, the Zari began to adopt some of these strategies themselves, learning to act faster and more decisively while maintaining care for their delicate ecosystem. One day, a particularly violent storm struck the central city. The winds tore through streets, uprooting trees and scattering debris. Lightning hit a vital energy hub, threatening a complete blackout. Panic spread among the Zari, but the Deathworlders acted immediately. They moved as a coordinated team, securing structures, restoring power lines, and preventing flooding. The Zari joined them, following instructions and assisting where they could. The scene was chaotic but controlled, a mixture of fear, determination, and efficiency. In the midst of destruction, a sense of unity emerged. The Zari realized that their survival depended on trust and collaboration. Every decision mattered, every action had consequences, and in this crucible, courage and skill were forged. By the time the storm passed, the central city was damaged but standing. Systems were functioning again and lives were saved. The Zari and the Deathworlders gathered to survey the aftermath. There was exhaustion, but also a quiet pride. They had faced the fury of nature together and survived. The aliens began to understand that these trials were teaching them more than technical skills. They were teaching resilience, bravery, and teamwork. The Deathworlders had become more than helpers. They were teachers, guides, and partners in survival. The planet itself seemed to respond, slowly stabilizing as if acknowledging the combined efforts of both species. Over the following days, as the storm subsided, the Zari and Deathworlders continued to repair and strengthen the cities. They shared techniques and methods, learning from each other in ways neither species could have imagined. The Zari learned to anticipate environmental hazards with greater skill. The Deathworlders adapted to the delicate ecosystems, ensuring their interventions caused minimal harm. Together, they transformed the planet from a place of vulnerability into a world of resilience. The crisis had revealed the potential within both species and demonstrated that even the most dangerous challenges could be overcome with cooperation. By the end of this period, the Zari looked around their recovering planet and saw not only survival, but the beginnings of a new future. Systems were stronger, communities were more unified, and lessons had been learned that would last generations. The Deathworlders, once strangers and feared outsiders, were now indispensable partners. The aliens understood that their world had been changed forever, not just by the storms but by the courage, skill, and determination of beings who had arrived unexpectedly and taught them what it truly meant to survive. And as the twin suns set on a recovering planet, the Zari knew that whatever came next, they were stronger together than they had ever been alone. With the storms finally passing, the Zari had time to reflect on everything that had happened. Their planet had been tested like never before, and the lessons learned were extraordinary. The streets of their cities, once damaged and chaotic, now hummed with repaired energy systems. Bridges and towers once threatened by collapse stood strong, reinforced with the knowledge and skill of both the Zari and the Deathworlders. Rivers flowed steadily, no longer overflowing and causing harm. And most importantly, the alien population had learned a new form of courage, one born from trust, cooperation, and the willingness to face danger without hesitation. The Deathworlders, who had seemed so distant and intimidating when they first arrived, were now respected allies. The Zari had watched them work tirelessly, never complaining, never faltering, even in the face of destruction. Their presence had been a revelation. They taught the Zari that survival was about more than careful planning. It was about adaptability, patience, and understanding the environment in ways that the Zari had never imagined. Every action, every decision, had demonstrated a level of skill and courage that inspired admiration. Slowly, bonds formed, not of friendship in the traditional sense, but of mutual respect and shared purpose. The Zari realized that the universe was larger and more complex than they had understood. There were beings with capabilities beyond their imagination, and yet those beings could choose to help rather than harm. With stability returning, the Zari began to focus on rebuilding their society for the long term. Cities were repaired using techniques learned from the Deathworlders, combining the Zari's careful planning with the newcomers' resilience and adaptability. Energy systems were strengthened, forests were monitored to prevent damage from future storms, and rivers were carefully channeled to maintain balance. The Zari population began to recover emotionally as well. Fear, which had dominated life for weeks, gave way to confidence and hope. Children explored areas that had once been off limits, marveling at the teamwork between their species and the Deathworlders. Families shared stories of survival, recounting how the strangers had arrived and helped save the planet. These stories became part of the culture, a reminder of what could be accomplished when courage and cooperation came together. The Zari also realized that their understanding of the universe had grown. For generations, they had lived in a comfortable isolation, exploring their world but rarely interacting with civilizations beyond their own. The arrival of the Deathworlders had opened their eyes to the possibilities of life in other galaxies, the variety of survival skills and the strength that could be found in unexpected places. They began to develop plans for future exploration and communication with distant species, inspired by the lessons of collaboration and resilience. The planet, once isolated and vulnerable, was now connected in ways the Zari had never imagined. Even as peace returned, the Zari remained vigilant. They knew that the universe was unpredictable and that challenges could arise again. But they were no longer afraid. They had learned to trust their own abilities, their knowledge, and the strength of those who came to help in times of crisis. The Deathworlders, too, had become an integral part of this understanding. Though they would eventually leave to continue their journeys across the galaxy, their impact on the Zari world was permanent. They had shown that survival required not only skill but courage, cooperation, and a willingness to act decisively when faced with danger. In the quiet evenings, as the twin moons rose above the repaired cities, the Zari would gather to reflect. They looked at their world, still vibrant, still alive, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Their survival had been uncertain, and yet they had endured. The Deathworlders had taught them more than techniques or strategies. They had shown the Zari what it truly meant to face challenges without fear and to rise above adversity. Hope had returned to the planet, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The story of the storms and the arrival of the Deathworlders became a cornerstone of Zari history. It was a tale of survival, courage, and the unlikely bonds formed when worlds collided. It reminded the Zari that the universe was vast and full of surprises, that help could come from the most unexpected places, and that even in the darkest moments, determination and collaboration could turn despair into triumph. Their planet had survived, but more than that, it had grown stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever the cosmos might bring. As the Zari looked to the stars, they no longer felt isolated. They had learned that life in the universe was connected, unpredictable, and full of opportunity. And though the future was unknown, one truth was certain. Together, with courage, adaptability, and the lessons of the Deathworlders, they could endure anything. The cry for help that had once seemed desperate had transformed into a story of hope.